The funeral was supposed to be a moment of respect, a sacred time when the village gathered to mourn the loss of one of their own. The air was heavy with sorrow, women wailed in deep cries of mourning, and men bowed their heads in silence as the drummers played slow, sorrowful beats. But then, just when everyone thought the day would pass as expected, a shocking figure appeared at the edge of the gathering. All eyes turned, and whispers immediately began to rise like smoke from a fire. Dressed in black, her steps slow but deliberate, she walked forward with her head held high. The closer she came, the more the tension in the air thickened. It was her, everyone knew who she was. She was the woman people had whispered about for years, the woman many believed to be the deceased man's mistress. And now, in front of the grieving wife and family, she did the unthinkable, she took her place in the front row. Gasps spread across the mourners like a ripple in water. The front row was sacred space, reserved only for the closest of kin, the wife, the children, and the family of the deceased. Yet here she was, claiming a seat of honor as though she had every right. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others leaned in to whisper furiously, while the wife's eyes filled with both pain and fury at the sight of the woman sitting so boldly. How dare she sit there? How dare she turn a funeral into a battlefield of secrets? But the mistress did not lower her gaze. She sat still, her face pale, her expression unreadable. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps defiance, no one could tell. What was clear, however, was that her presence had broken the fragile silence of the day. Suddenly, the funeral was no longer just about honoring the dead, it was about the living, about the secret life of the man they had come to bury, and the two women who now sat side by side in unbearable tension. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, some unable to look away, others pretending not to notice but still straining their ears for the whispers that spread quickly. Was she really his mistress? Did he love her? What will the wife do now? The drums continued to beat, the rituals carried on, but everyone knew this funeral would not be remembered for the songs of mourning, it would be remembered for the shocking moment when the mistress sat in the front row. The village had always treated funerals as more than just a farewell, they were sacred ceremonies that bound the living and the dead. On that day, the atmosphere carried a mix of grief and tradition, every detail steeped in culture passed down through generations. The moment news of the man's death spread, preparations began. Women dressed in long black cloths gathered early, their heads wrapped tightly, their faces heavy with sorrow. Their wails pierced the morning air, echoing across the huts and farmland, a cry that told the ancestors that another soul was on its way home. The men gathered under the tall trees, their faces solemn, their conversation hushed, as if the mere sound of laughter would dishonor the dead. Drums played in slow, heavy rhythms that carried across the entire village, announcing that a life had ended. Each beat was both a call and a reminder, pulling people from their homes to gather for the ceremony. Children stood quietly in the distance, their eyes wide with curiosity, too young to fully understand the depth of loss but old enough to feel the heaviness that gripped the community. The elders, draped in symbolic garments, took their place at the center. Their role was clear, they would guide the rituals, chant the prayers, and ensure that tradition was upheld so that the spirit of the departed could rest in peace. The funeral ground itself was arranged with precision. Mats were spread at the front, where the immediate family sat today. The wife of the deceased sat closest to the coffin, her shoulders trembling as she fought to contain her sobs. Relatives surrounded her, touching her arms, whispering words of comfort, though no words could mend the hollow space death had left behind. Further behind, neighbors and distant villagers filled every available space, sitting on the ground, leaning against trees, or standing with folded arms. All eyes, though respectful, occasionally drifted to the front row, where grief sat like a queen. The air was thick with incense smoke, rising slowly into the sky, believed to carry prayers to the ancestors. Women carried clay pots of water and calabashes of palm wine, offerings for the spirits, while the elders muttered blessings over them. Every gesture, every chant, was a reminder that death in the village was not just the end of one man's life, it was a communal event, a moment where everyone gathered to face the fragility of existence together. It was into this sacred atmosphere of respect, grief, and tradition that the shocking presence of the mistress would later bring disruption. The man whose body now lay in the wooden coffin at the front of the gathering had been more than just another villager, he was a figure who commanded respect. To many, he was remembered as a hard-working farmer whose sweat had helped feed not only his family but also neighbors in times of scarcity. He was strong, tall, and carried himself with quiet authority, the kind of man whose word in village meetings carried weight. He was a father, a husband, and a son of the soil, and for years people had spoken of him with admiration. His fields were among the most fruitful, his compound always filled with the laughter of children, and his generosity was known beyond the boundaries of the village. If someone lacked food, he would offer maize. If a family struggled with work, he was the first to lend his oxen. To most, he was a man to be honored. But behind the smiles and the reputation lay a truth that only a few dared to whisper. He had lived two lives, one in the open, as the devoted husband and family man, and another in the shadows, where passion and desire led him into the arms of a woman who was not his wife. That woman, the mistress, was not a stranger to the villagers. Her beauty had always drawn eyes, and though she carried herself with dignity, her connection to him had not escaped the sharp tongues of gossip. Rumors had spread in hushed voices for years, murmurs of late-night visits, of gifts given in secret, of glances exchanged during public gatherings. Still, no one ever confronted him, partly out of respect, partly out of fear of his position. To his wife, he was the pillar of their household, the man who provided and protected. She knew him as the father of her children, the man she had stood beside through struggles and triumphs. Yet even she, in her heart, had felt the weight of suspicion at times. Nights when he returned late, unexplained journeys, whispers that reached her ears, she had chosen to bury those doubts, clinging to her dignity and her place as the wife. In the village, a wife's silence was often mistaken for strength, but only she knew how much that silence cost her. Now, as his body lay still, the truth he had hidden in life stood ready to reveal itself in death. The mistress's arrival at the funeral was more than a scandal, it was the shadow of his secret stepping into the light. For the villagers, the man would be remembered both as the respected husband and father, and as the man who had carried a forbidden love to his grave. The wife sat in the front row, her frame bent under the weight of grief, her black cloth wrapped tightly around her body as if it alone could hold her broken spirit together. Her eyes were swollen from sleepless nights of crying, her cheeks streaked with tears that refused to dry. She had not eaten properly for days, and her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the mat on which she sat, as though letting go would mean losing the last tie to the man she had shared her life with. The villagers, as they filed in and found their places, could not look at her without feeling the sting of sorrow. She was the image of a widow, broken, vulnerable, and yet dignified. Around her, relatives hovered like protective wings. Her sisters whispered words of comfort, though their own eyes were heavy with grief. Her mother-in-law, older now and fragile, leaned close to her, reminding her to stay strong for the children, her voice cracking with every sentence. Her own children, confused and overwhelmed, sat nearby, clinging to her arms, their innocence unable to comprehend the finality of death. Every so often, one of them would cry softly, their small voices piercing through the heavy silence, and she would gather them close, wiping their tears even as her own streamed freely. She carried the double weight of her grief and her duty as a mother, her heart split open yet still beating for the ones who looked to her for strength. In the village, the wife of the deceased held a sacred role during funerals. She was both the chief mourner and the keeper of her husband's memory. Her position in the front row was not merely tradition, it was her rightful place, earned through years of loyalty, endurance, and sacrifice. Everyone present understood that this was her moment of mourning, her place to grieve without interruption. She had walked beside her husband through seasons of planting and harvest, through celebrations and hardships, and now she sat beside him for the last time, in silence and sorrow. Yet beneath her tears lay another unspoken pain, one she could not voice in the midst of ritual. For while she grieved the man she had lost, whispers of his other life had long haunted her nights. She had endured rumors, denied them with silence, and carried her dignity like a shield. But today, as she sat in the front row, unaware of the storm that was about to strike, she believed for a brief moment that at least this day, this funeral, would be hers alone. It was her husband's farewell, her place of honor, her grief to bear before the eyes of the village. And it was into this fragile space of sorrow that another woman would soon intrude, changing everything. The crowd was silent except for the low, steady rhythm of the drums and the faint sobbing of the women, when suddenly a ripple of unease spread through the mourners. Heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers rose like a wave. From the far end of the path, she appeared, the woman who had lived in the shadows of another's household, the one whose name had been whispered behind closed doors for years. She was dressed in deep mourning attire, a long black wrapper tied around her waist, her head covered in a black scarf, her steps slow but firm. Every eye followed her as she walked, the sound of her sandals on the dusty earth louder than the drums in that tense moment. She carried herself with an unsettling calm, neither timid nor ashamed. Her face was pale, her eyes glistened as though tears had already washed through them, but her back remained straight. Some women gasped and clutched their beads, men shook their heads in disbelief, and children, sensing the tension, tugged at their mother's arms for explanations. No one needed to ask who she was. Everyone knew. She was the mistress, the woman who had shared the deceased man's affection in secret, the silent shadow that had hovered near his life, now stepping into the spotlight in the most daring way possible. When she reached the front, where the wife sat with her children and relatives, the air seemed to freeze. For a brief moment, time itself stopped. The wife's tear-streaked face lifted, and her red, swollen eyes locked onto the intruder. A hush fell over the entire gathering, even the wails and chants softened, as though the ancestors themselves had paused to witness the audacity of the moment. Without hesitation, the mistress lowered herself gracefully onto the mat, not in the back where strangers and neighbors sat, not even among the distant relatives, but right there, in the sacred front row, beside the grieving family. Gasps escaped from the crowd. It was a silent rebellion, a declaration louder than any words. She was claiming her place, demanding recognition of the bond she had shared with the man they were burying. Some villagers whispered furiously, "How dare she? This is an insult." Others, though shocked, muttered, "But she too loved him, maybe she has the right to grieve." The wife's body stiffened, her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her silence screamed louder than any outburst. Between the two women, grief now carried two faces, one of rightful wife, the other of forbidden lover, sitting side by side in the most public display of rivalry the village had ever seen. The air inside the funeral ground grew heavy, as though the very earth itself had taken notice of the audacious act. For a long moment, silence reigned, broken only by the faint thud of the drum and the wails that now sounded uncertain, trembling. Then, like wind passing through tall grass, whispers began to rise, soft at first, then louder, multiplying until the entire crowd was buzzing. Heads turned, eyes darted from the grieving wife to the bold mistress who had taken her seat beside the family, and disbelief painted itself across every face. "How dare she sit there?" hissed one old woman, tugging at the edge of her wrapper in agitation. Another leaned toward her neighbor, her voice low but sharp. "Does she not know that place is sacred? Only family may sit there." A group of young men standing at the back clenched their jaws, muttering to one another, their expressions a mix of anger and shame. Some even threatened under their breath to drag her away, but none moved, perhaps out of fear of disrupting the sanctity of the funeral, or perhaps out of curiosity to see what would unfold. Not everyone condemned her. Some, especially the younger women, glanced at her with a strange mix of admiration and pity. "She must have loved him too," one whispered, her eyes softening. "Would she have the courage to sit there if her grief wasn't real?" But even as those few defended her, their voices were drowned beneath the roar of disapproval sweeping through the crowd. The elders in particular were deeply unsettled. To them, tradition was clear: the front row belonged to blood, to wives and children, to those whose bond could never be questioned. For an outsider, worse, a mistress, to sit there was not just bold, it was a violation of custom, an insult to the family and to the spirit of the man being buried. Children, sensing the tension, clung to their mother's arms, their wide eyes darting between the adults as if trying to decode the unspoken war being fought in whispers and glares. Some women covered their mouths, their shock too great to hide. Others shook their heads with pity for the wife, whispering, "She has lost her husband, and now she must bear this humiliation." The funeral had been meant to honor the dead, to carry his soul peacefully to the ancestors. Instead, the living were consumed by scandal, their attention torn from the coffin to the two women who now embodied the man's divided life. In that moment, the funeral was no longer just about mourning, it had become a public drama, a silent battle of pride, love, and betrayal. And though no one dared raise their voice openly, every whisper carried the same question: what will happen next? Long before the coffin was laid in the center of the funeral ground, long before the mistress dared to step into the front row, there had been nights and stolen hours that only the two of them knew. The affair had not begun with scandal in mind, it had started with stolen glances, quiet conversations at the edge of the marketplace, a lingering touch when he came to buy palm oil or maize from her stall. For the mistress, he had been more than a lover, he had been a secret universe, a man whose presence filled the silence of her lonely hut, whose laughter softened the weight of her solitude. She lived for those brief encounters, for the sound of his footsteps approaching after dusk when the village roads were quiet, for the way his voice grew softer when it was just the two of them. But their love came with chains. While he returned each night to his wife and children, she was left with the emptiness of waiting. She knew she was the shadow in his life, the woman whose name could never be spoken aloud in his compound. She endured the pain of hiding, of watching him walk past her in public with only a curt nod, pretending she was nothing more than another villager. Each festival, each wedding, each communal gathering was a reminder that his hand would never hold hers openly, that his smile in public belonged to another woman. Yet, despite the secrecy, there were moments when he made her believe she was the only one who truly understood him. He spoke to her about dreams he never voiced to his wife, about the burdens of leadership, about his frustrations and fears. In those moments, she felt she was not merely his lover but his confidant, the one who carried the pieces of him too fragile to be shared elsewhere. It was this closeness, this intimacy born in the shadows, that bound her to him more tightly than the shame of her position ever could. Still, love in the shadows is a wound that never fully heals. Nights when he failed to come, when she heard the laughter of his family drifting through the village air, she wept quietly into her pillow, knowing her place in his life would always be half hidden, half denied. She longed to claim him openly, but she also knew the price, her reputation, his family's honor, the peace of the village. So she carried her pain silently, consoled only by the fragile hope that at least in private, she was loved. Now, as she sat boldly at his funeral, dressed in black like any rightful mourner, her grief was not just for the man in the coffin but for the years spent in silence, the love lived in whispers, the sacrifices made in the shadows. Her presence there was not only defiance, it was a desperate cry that her story, too, deserved to be seen. The air around the front row was thick with silence, a silence sharper than the loudest cry. The wife, her eyes swollen with grief, finally turned her head toward the woman who had dared to sit beside her. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the funeral transformed into a battlefield where no words were spoken, yet volumes of pain, anger, and defiance were exchanged. The wife's gaze was heavy, not just with mourning but with unspoken accusation. "How dare you?" it seemed to ask. "How dare you intrude on the only place left for me to grieve my husband?" The mistress, however, did not lower her eyes. Though her hands trembled slightly in her lap, she sat with a quiet boldness, her face pale but resolute. Her look carried no arrogance, only a raw plea to be acknowledged. She, too, had loved the man they were burying, and though the world denied her place, she refused to be erased. She sat as if saying, "I was part of his life too. My love may have been hidden, but it was real." The villagers closest to the front row shifted uncomfortably. Whispers began to swell again, this time sharper, more urgent. A cousin of the deceased leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper, "We must remove her. This is a shame to the family." Another relative, an older aunt, shook her head firmly. "No. If we drag her now, the funeral will turn into chaos. Let the dead rest. There will be time to deal with her after." The debate simmered beneath the sound of drums and chants, like fire hidden under ash, threatening to blaze out at any moment. Some of the younger men stood at the back, fists clenched, waiting for a signal to act. Women covered their mouths in shock, peering from the wife to the mistress, wondering who would break first. The wife's body stiffened, her breathing heavy as though she was holding back an outburst. The mistress kept her composure, though the wetness gathering in her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. It was a moment suspended in time, two women, bound by one man's choices, locked in a silent war for recognition. One had the rightful claim of marriage and children, the other the forbidden but undeniable bond of love. The coffin lay between them, the man who had tied their fates together now powerless to mediate the storm he had left behind. And though neither woman spoke, the entire village knew that their presence side by side would be remembered long after the funeral drums stopped beating. For a long while, the tension sat heavier than the coffin itself. The villagers could sense that the funeral was teetering on the edge of chaos, and the eyes of the mourners kept darting between the wife, the mistress, and the family elders seated a few rows away. The whispers had grown so loud that they seemed to overpower the steady beat of the drums. Children were hushed by their mothers, while men at the back leaned forward, waiting to see whether the family would rise in anger or let silence swallow the insult. It was then that the eldest uncle of the deceased, a man with gray hair and a voice that commanded respect, slowly stood up. Leaning on his staff, he lifted his hand to silence the crowd. The murmurs died down instantly. He looked first at the wife, whose eyes still glistened with tears, then at the mistress, who sat rigid and defiant, refusing to move despite the daggers of judgment pointed at her through countless stares. After a long pause, his deep voice rolled over the gathering. "Death," he said, "does not only bury the body. It uncovers truths we pretend not to see. Today, we mourn a man who gave life to this family, who walked with honor in this village, but he also carried secrets in his heart. The woman who sits here," he gestured toward the mistress, "is not a stranger to him. Whether we accept it or not, she too carries grief. And grief cannot be denied." A heavy murmur swept through the mourners. Some nodded reluctantly, while others shook their heads, muttering about tradition and respect. The wife sat frozen, her body trembling as her children clung tighter to her sides. Relatives whispered frantically, Shall we let her remain? It is shameful. But what will removing her prove? The dead is gone. The debate raged in hushed voices, but the elder raised his hand again, silencing them all. Let there be no fighting in front of the dead, he continued, his voice firm. If he was man enough to divide his love in life, then we must be wise enough to carry his truth in death. Today, the wife remains the pillar of his home, the mother of his children, the rightful keeper of his memory. But this woman, his eyes shifted to the mistress, whose tears now streamed freely, also deserves her place to grieve. Not as wife, not as family, but as one who loved and lost. His words settled like dust after a storm. Some shook their heads in disagreement, but no one dared challenge him openly. The wife, though wounded, remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together. The mistress bowed her head, her hands trembling in her lap, finally breaking the defiance she had carried into the funeral. And so, in that fragile moment, a resolution was reached. She was allowed to stay, not out of full acceptance, but out of respect for the dead and the understanding that death does not erase the complexities of life. The drums resumed their rhythm, mourners bowed their heads again, and the funeral continued. But in the hearts of everyone present, a truth had been carved deeply. When a man's choices leave behind two grieving women, the ancestors themselves must bear witness to the storm he has sown. When the final shovel of red earth fell upon the coffin, the wails of the women rose once more, echoing across the village. Yet beneath those cries was something deeper than mourning, a silence heavy with reflection. The funeral had not been only about laying a man to rest, it had been about unearthing the truth he left behind. The wife, broken yet dignified, walked away with her children, carrying both the honor and the burden of her position. The mistress, though shamed and judged, remained seated a moment longer, her black cloth heavy on her shoulders, her tears soaking the ground as if to claim her share of grief. The villagers returned to their compounds whispering, but their whispers were not only about scandal, they were about the fragile threads of love, betrayal, and tradition that bind human lives together. Some shook their heads in disapproval, saying the mistress should never have sat where she did. Others argued in hushed tones that her presence revealed a truth too deep to ignore. The man they had respected was not only a father, husband, and leader, but also a flawed human whose choices carried hidden consequences. In the days that followed, the story of the funeral became more than gossip. It became a parable told around firesides, a reminder that the choices made in life are never buried with the body. Secrets, once revealed, have the power to wound, to divide, but also to teach. The elders, when asked about that day, would simply say, the dead leave behind more than their names, they leave behind the truth of how they lived. The lesson was clear, though painful: true love cannot survive without honesty, and betrayal leaves scars that even death cannot hide. Tradition demands respect, but it also forces the living to confront realities they would rather ignore. In that village, the funeral became not only a farewell but a mirror reflecting the complexity of human hearts. And so, the moral echoed like the fading beat of the funeral drum: when secrets come to light, love, betrayal, and tradition collide. The funeral was not just a farewell, but a lesson, that the choices we make in life continue to echo long after we are gone.